The familiar click of a bunch of keys echoed in the silence of a chilly autumn afternoon. I, Laura Bennett, 35, an accountant with a tight schedule and a long to-do list, gently pushed open the door of my parents' house in the Chicago suburbs. Inside, a false coziness pervaded the space. The scent of baking cookies wafted from the kitchen, and the golden sunlight streamed through the windows, softly bathing the polished wood floors. Today, I arrived earlier than usual to pick up my son, Ethan, 7, after an afternoon at his grandparents' house. Normally, I would have knocked and waited, but somehow, a vague premonition made me push the door open and walk in. As I stepped through the door, a sound stopped me. It wasn't the familiar sound of children's laughter or the cheerful chatter. It was a gruff, angry voice, the haunting sound I knew all too well, mixed with the frightened whisper of a child. My heart sank. I recognized the voice as my father, George, and Ethan. I tiptoed into the living room, looking around warily. The sight before me made every cell in my body freeze. Ethan was standing in a corner, his eyes wide and filled with tears, his brown hair falling down, partially covering his small face. In front of him was my father, George, a thin but intimidatingly authoritative figure, angrily pointing at a broken toy lying on the floor. "You useless bastard!" My father's voice thundered through the room, piercing my very being. "You can't even keep a toy. Do you know how much it costs? You destroyer." Ethan mumbled, his voice trembling as if he was about to cry. I'm sorry, sir." The boy lowered his head, his small shoulders shaking. I scanned the room. My mother, Margaret, stood silently in the kitchen doorway, her lips pressed together, her eyes staring. Not a word, not a gesture, not a hint of intervention. The icy silence sent a chill down my spine, as if I were looking back at my own childhood in a mirror. My sister Rachel sat on the sofa opposite, her blonde hair loose, her eyes glued to her phone. She was completely oblivious to what was going on, only glancing up occasionally with a quizzical smirk. Her two daughters, Lily and Sophie, were giggling in the corner, absorbed in their own game, oblivious to the pain evident on their cousin's face. A simmering anger began to creep up inside me. Not the kind that erupted immediately, but a fire that burned under the surface, kindled in the ashes of buried memories. My father's harsh words to Ethan were like a replay of my own childhood trauma. I remember clearly the times I brought home my nines with childish pride, only to receive a lukewarm nod. Then my mother would immediately turn to Rachel, my perfect sister, and brag about her perfect tens or the compliments her teachers gave her. Rachel was always the center, the light that was praised no matter what mistakes she made. As for me, I was always like a shadow, chasing after that light but never close enough to touch it. I also cannot forget the times when I accidentally spilled water or broke a bowl. My father would scold me severely, not sparing any insults. "She is useless. She can't do anything," he would often scream. But if Rachel did something similar, my mother would immediately defend her. "She is just clumsy. It's nothing." Those words were engraved in my mind, turning into invisible scars, making me grow up with the feeling that I was not good enough, not worthy of being loved. The choking, stifling feeling was like a cold electric current running down my spine. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my chest. Looking at Ethan, I could see myself in his frightened eyes. What I had endured, the pain I had tried to cover up with time, was now playing out before me. This time with my son as the victim, a spark of anger burned fiercely in my chest. No, I couldn't let this happen again. I couldn't let my child suffer the wounds I had borne. The silent fight to protect Ethan and to reclaim my stolen childhood began in that moment. I knew that from then on, nothing would ever be the same again. The car rolled slowly on the familiar road leading home, but the air inside was heavy and suffocating. Ethan sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the rows of houses passing by outside the window, his face sad and distant. I tried to talk to him, asking him about the afternoon at his grandparents' house, but he only responded with short, soft sentences like a breeze. Yes, nothing. His usual bright eyes and chirping voice were gone. Looking at Ethan through the rearview mirror, my heart felt like it was tightening. The scene at my parents' house still lingered in my mind like a ghost, stirring up painful memories that I thought had been buried deep for a long time. Memories of my childhood came flooding back, so clear it took my breath away. A childhood overshadowed by the great shadow of my older sister, Rachel. She was 3 years older than me, and in my parents' eyes, she seemed to be the embodiment of perfection. I vividly remembered the times I brought home my test papers with a 9, eager to receive a compliment. But all I got in return was a lukewarm nod, a dry, Then my mother would quickly turn to Rachel, her favorite daughter, to tell her about her perfect 10 or a positive comment from a teacher. Our Rachel is really good. She spoke with pride while I stood still, feeling like a pale shadow in my own family. I remember vividly the times when Rachel was given new clothes and expensive gifts that I could only dream of. Meanwhile, I always had to wear her old clothes, and for my birthday and Christmas, I only received simple, cheap gifts. I never dared to ask for anything, because I knew that asking would be useless. I learned to accept that favoritism as a given, as an indispensable part of life. Every parent-teacher conference was a pain in the ass. Teachers would praise me for being hardworking, smart, and promising. But my parents would just mumble and then quickly turn the conversation to Rachel, even though she was always a troublemaker at school. In their eyes, Rachel was always a source of pride, and I was just a bland background. I remember clearly the moment I received a full scholarship to a prestigious university, a dream I had pursued for many years. I ran home, my heart filled with hope for a compliment, a hug, a recognition. But all I received was my father's cold and indifferent words. Studying like this will save my parents money. Those words were like a slap in the face to my self-esteem, extinguishing all the joy that had just flared up inside me. That was when I realized, no matter how hard I tried, how successful I was, in their eyes, I was just a burden, a useful tool. Even after I graduated and became a successful accountant, their recognition never came. Instead, I was seen as a living bank, a reliable source of financial support. I thought about how I had been quietly paying my parents' rent for the past 3 years. At first, it was just a temporary help, but then their reckless spending habits and lack of planning made the support grow, turning into a huge burden on my shoulders. I can't forget the call from my mother 3 years ago. Her voice was full of despair, saying that they were about to lose their house because they couldn't pay the debt. I called Rachel to find a solution together, but she just gently pushed the responsibility. You know, it's hard for me too. The children are grown up, tuition, food, everything. You're an accountant, you can handle it, right? Her voice was light, as if helping my parents was something that was naturally my job. And I, out of blind filial piety, out of a desire to be loved, to be recognized, did not hesitate to take on the burden. I withdrew all my savings, even borrowed money to help them through. I thought that maybe if I sacrificed enough, if I was devoted enough, they would see me, would love me the way they loved Rachel. Why am I doing this? I asked myself, feeling bitter. Am I trying to buy their love? Just like when I was little, I tried to study well, tried to be obedient just to get a look from them, but they always looked at Rachel. I slowly realized the toxic dependency my parents had placed on me. Not just financially, but emotionally. They saw me as someone who was always willing to sacrifice, never daring to say no. And I unconsciously lived in that cycle, trading myself over and over again for feelings that were not genuine. My desire for recognition, for love, had made me a victim of a mental and financial trap that I had no idea about. Now, when I look into Ethan's sad, frightened eyes, I see my old self reflected back at me. And I know that if I don't break this cycle, if I don't stop, my son will be caught in the same spiral that I was. The following days passed in my house with a thick, heavy atmosphere, as if a gray cloud had quietly covered every corner. Ethan, the son who was always lively, smiling, and full of energy, now became alarmingly quiet. He spoke less, easily got angry over small things, or withdrew into a corner, absorbed in coloring books, which had previously been a side game to innocent running around. I began to notice that he showed signs of anxiety, especially when I asked him to help with something around the house. Ethan used to be excited when asked to do small tasks, picking up toys, helping his mother wash dishes, or wiping the table, as if it were a great joy. But lately, he has been doing everything with a cautious, clumsy, and unconfident attitude. Small mistakes make him overly stressed. I remember one evening when I asked him to wipe the dining table after dinner. Ethan held the towel, but his little hands were shaking. A little water from the towel dripped onto the table. Normally, he might laugh or say, "Ouch," playfully. But this time, he was startled, cowering, eyes wide with fear as if he was waiting for a fierce scolding to come. My heart sank. I bent down, hugged him tightly, and said, "It's okay, honey. It's just water. Let me help you clean it up." Ethan rubbed his head against my chest, his voice soft as if he was about to cry. "Grandpa said I was slow and useless. When I dropped the cup, I was so scared, Mom." His words were like a cold knife cutting through my chest. The glass Ethan had mentioned must have been the broken toy at his grandparents' house. And I knew it wasn't the only time. I realized that my father's harsh, uncontrolled words had instilled in my son the same feelings of fear, shame, and guilt that I had endured as a child. I couldn't stand by and watch my son go down the same path. I had to talk. I had to speak up. That evening, I called my mother. I tried to keep my voice calm, but unease crept into my voice. "Mom, Ethan seems sad these days. He told me that Grandpa scolded him." There was a sigh from the other end, heavy but uncomprehending. "Oh, Laura," my mother said, exasperated, as if I were making a big deal out of it. "You're being too sensitive. George just wanted to train him up. Boys have to be strong, not weak." Before I could reply, my father's voice, Mr. George, rang out gruff and harsh. He clearly snatched the phone. "Don't make a big deal out of it. Boys have to be tough, understand? They have to learn to be independent. They can't always rely on others. I've scolded you before, but you didn't die." Then he hung up the phone abruptly, not giving me a chance to respond. I was stunned. My parents' denial, their cold indifference, left me feeling like I was falling into a void. Not only did they not admit their mistakes, they treated their nephew's pain as if it were nothing. All the hopes I had harbored, that they would change, that they would love Ethan the way they had not loved me, were shattered in an instant. Despite the pain, disappointment, and anger, I continued to send money to my parents. Partly it was out of habit, because of the sense of responsibility that had been ingrained in me since I was a child. Another part, perhaps naively, was that I still nurtured a fragile belief. If I sacrificed enough, if I endured long enough, then maybe they would soften, be gentler with Ethan. Or at least they would realize that I, the seemingly invisible girl, had always been silently standing behind them, for this family. But everything changed after that. I could no longer turn a blind eye. I began to observe Ethan's every move, every expression. I noted his startles, his fearful words, the times he avoided my gaze. I dove into the signs of trauma, and every line of information I read sent a shiver down my spine, so similar to what was happening to my son. My parents' denial and domination not only devastated me, but also served as a powerful wake-up call for me. I knew I couldn't change them, but I could, and must, protect Ethan from the toxic cycle I had been trapped in. I would not let him grow up with invisible scars on his soul, as I had. This was more than parenting. This was a fight, a journey to regain my child's peace. and I would fight to the end. One seemingly normal Saturday afternoon, I decided to go to my parents' house earlier than expected without notice. Still worried about Ethan and their indifference, I needed to see for myself, to have no doubt about my son's feelings. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I immediately felt an eerie silence throughout the house. Only the sound of grumbling from the kitchen echoed in the cold, still air. A bad feeling suddenly came over me and I held my breath. I quietly walked towards the sound. The air in the kitchen was thick, as if it contained something dark and heavy. And then, the scene before my eyes made my heart clench. My father, George, was standing right next to Ethan. My son had his head down, his shoulders shaking, holding a wet towel in his hand, trying to clean the food stains on the table. But his little hands were shaking violently, as if frozen in fear. "You idiot," my father growled, like thunder echoing through the room. "Can't you see that it's still dirty? How did you clean it? Do you have eyes? Can you do anything worthwhile?" Ethan's voice was as small as a mosquito's, almost inaudible. I wiped it. It's in the corner of the room. Lily and Sophie, my nieces, sat down, eating cookies and drinking chocolate milk, their faces innocent but their eyes glancing at Ethan with disdain. They giggled at each other, as if the scene before them was nothing strange. My sister Rachel sat cross-legged on the sofa in the living room, her eyes glued to her phone. She glanced up briefly, a nonchalant smirk on her lips, then looked back down, completely indifferent. No one intervened. No one spoke. My mother, Margaret, was busy chopping vegetables at the sink. She just sighed, a hollow sigh, as if this had all become too familiar to her. She didn't say a word, nor did she make a gesture of protest. Her eyes were cold, as if watching her grandchild being scolded and trembling was like watching a cloud of dust drift past a window. And that was the last straw. All the resentment I had accumulated, from the emotional abuse I'd endured as a child, to the helplessness I felt when Ethan suffered the same, flared into a rage that not only burned away my fear, but also gave me a strength I'd never known. I walked into the kitchen, my shoes clicking loudly on the floor. The room froze as I raised my voice, the voice of a mother who could no longer stand silence. "Dad, enough!" George turned around, his face red with anger. "What are you doing here? Are you here to cause trouble? Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." I didn't bother to reply. My eyes swept over Rachel, who was looking up at me with a quizzical look. I spoke firmly, forcefully, like the woman they no longer recognized. "Rachel, your son is happily eating his cake, and Ethan is being treated like trash. I demand that you take him out of here immediately." Rachel jerked, her face pale with shock. "Laura, what are you talking about? Who do you think you are giving me orders?" I stood tall, unflinching. Anger kept me sane. "I'm not giving orders. I'm protecting my child. And by the way, this is the house I'm paying rent on. So if you don't want to hear the truth, you can leave." I turned to my parents. Their voices were cold, firm, and cruel. "From today, I will stop paying rent." There was a dead silence. George stood there, his eyes wide with shock. Margaret looked at me as if she had just heard something unacceptable. "Laura, are you crazy? Are you going to leave us like this?" My mother stammered, her hand shaking beside the vegetable pot. "Not just any." I looked straight at her, each word like a knife cutting through the blind bonds of years of ignorance. "I am protecting my little family. Ethan will not live in fear like I did. I will not let history repeat itself. Not again." I grabbed Ethan's hand. His little hand was cold, and pulled him out of the kitchen. As I walked, I didn't look back. But I knew. They were looking at me with shock, anger, and maybe a little shame. "And if you ever want to see Ethan again," I turned my head one last time, my eyes an undeniable statement, From now on, it will be supervised visits only. I will take my son home. I led Ethan out of that house. The place that used to be called home, now only a lingering, painful memory. My steps were steady, each step a break from the chain of dependence, resignation, and hurt. That day, I chose Ethan over the past. I chose to stand on the side of light. As soon as Ethan and I stepped into my apartment, the atmosphere immediately became suffocatingly tense. The phone in my hand kept vibrating, each notification sounding like a storm coming from behind the closed door. A series of messages and calls poured in from all too familiar names: Dad, Mom, and Rachel. Each ting of the message was like a cold knife cutting into the fragile peace that I had just tried to build for myself and my son. The first message from George was, "You ungrateful son, who do you think you are to go against your parents? One day you will have to kneel down and apologize." This was followed by another, vicious and full of anger. "Do you want to see your parents on the street? You are worse than a beast." Margaret didn't curse, but stabbed with familiar emotional manipulation and reproach. "Laura, you're wrong. Family is everything. You're destroying this home." Another message followed, this time a plaintive lament. "Do you think about your ancestors? Do you know how hard it was for your parents to raise you?" Then the phone rang again. Rachel. I looked at her name on the screen, my hand froze. After a moment, I touched the answer button, either out of instinct or because I wanted to confront her. My sister's voice rang out, full of contempt, and the anger that had been suppressed for so long seemed to explode. "Are you crazy, Laura? Do you want to destroy this whole family? Without your money, how can my parents live? Or do you think you're so great? You're just a selfish girl, always playing the victim." Every word was like an arrow aimed at me. The screams, the taunts, the mental attacks, all of it seemed to tear down the wall I had built to protect myself. Guilt began to creep in, like an old ghost from the past. The years of being taught that children must sacrifice, that parents are always right and should never be disobeyed, it all came rushing back, like a huge wave threatening to wash away my sanity. I began to wonder, was I really being cruel? Was I making a mistake? I used to tremble every time I disappointed them. And now the feeling was back, even though my sanity knew I was doing the right thing. I looked at Ethan. He was huddled on the sofa, his little hands clenched, his eyes still filled with fear. Looking at him, I knew I couldn't let guilt guide me anymore. I had to stand firm. Ethan needed me to be strong. He deserved a mother who would stand up for him. I sat down next to him, my voice soft and full of concern. "Ethan, tell me, when you were at your grandparents' house, did they scold you a lot?" The boy hesitated, looking up at me as if to see if I really wanted to know. After a moment, Ethan began to tell me, his voice low and shaky, but every word was like a needle stabbing into my heart. He said Lily was smarter than me. Sophie was better than me. He said I always made mistakes, that I was stupid. He said I was slow at everything, not as good as my two sisters. He made me clean the house, wash the dishes, but I wasn't used to it. I was stunned. Ethan was only 7. It was too much for him. She kept looking at me and sighing, saying that her son was lazy and worked slowly like a turtle. She said that I wasn't as agile as Lily and Sophie. Every time that happened, I felt like I was the maid. Ethan continued, his voice trailing off. He also told me that as a boy, I had to do all the housework. Otherwise, I would grow up to be useless like my mother when she was little. I choked. Every time I did something wrong, he would scold me. "You're useless, just like your mother when she was little. Never doing anything right." The last sentence was like a cold knife, stabbing deep into my heart. "Just like your mother when she was young." He didn't just scold Ethan. He deliberately dragged me back to the dark shadow of my childhood, where I was also called useless, worthless, where every scolding was an imprint in my memory. My father's old words echoed in my head like a creepy song. No love, no recognition, only judgment and torment. I was shocked to realize This was not new. This mental abuse had been going on for a long time. Through every time Ethan visited his grandparents, I was just too busy providing, too busy, too trusting to notice. My son's words tore away the thin veil of guilt from my heart. I no longer doubted. I was not wrong. I did not destroy my family. I was saving my son from the very place that had destroyed my childhood. The texts, the calls, the scoldings, now they're just distant echoes. I know exactly where I am and why I have to keep going. This is a fight I can't afford to lose. Not for myself, but for Ethan, for his future. After a long night of stressful calls and threatening messages, I no longer had any hesitation. The guilt that had weighed heavily on me was now swept away by anger and a strong desire to protect my son at all costs. I knew it was time to act decisively. Early the next morning, while Ethan was still sleeping in the small room, I sat down at my desk, turned on my computer, and began to solve all the outstanding financial problems. I transferred all the money that I had been sending my parents for rent to a new savings account, in Ethan's name. Every penny was the result of my hard work, my sweat and tears over the years. Now, instead of feeding my parents' dependence and irresponsibility, that money would be used to protect and secure my son's future. I opened a safe savings account where my parents had absolutely no power to interfere. That way, I knew Ethan would have a solid financial foundation to learn and grow without fear. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was love. It was my promise to him. After completing the financial formalities, I picked up the phone and called Clara, my best friend, who had witnessed almost all of my difficult years. Clara was a strong, rational woman and had always been my strongest support whenever I felt down. I told her everything, holding nothing back, from my father's loud scolding of Ethan to the vicious accusations from my mother and sister to the internal battle between anger and guilt that had lasted for years. "Laura, you did the right thing," Clara said, her voice low but firm, without a hint of hesitation. "You did not do anything wrong by protecting your son. Your parents are not only manipulating you emotionally, they are hurting Ethan. It is time for you to put yourself and your son first. They are responsible for their lives, not you." Clara's words were like a powerful spiritual medicine, pulling me out of the dark cloud of chaotic thoughts. I felt lighter, more grounded. I was no longer alone. Clara was on my side, and most of all, I knew I was doing the right thing. Next, I took Ethan to see Dr. Carter, a respected child psychologist. During our first few sessions, with me there to provide reassurance, Dr. Carter gradually confirmed the suspicions I had been harboring all along. Ethan did indeed show signs of anxiety, low self-esteem, and chronic stress, direct results of emotional abuse. Children are very sensitive to the words of adults, especially their parents and grandparents, Dr. Carter gently explained. Scolding, comparisons, neglect, all of these can leave deep psychological scars. They can affect a child's self-esteem, emotional development, and inner security. Ethan needs a positive environment to heal and grow up healthy. Those words were like a nod from the universe, confirming that everything I was doing wasn't selfish. It was absolutely necessary. I no longer doubted myself. Protecting Ethan was my #1 priority and my most sacred duty. Soon after, I began cutting off unnecessary contact with my parents. I only responded to messages that were truly urgent, and I completely refused calls that didn't have a valid reason. I needed time and space to heal with my son, without falling into the spiral of manipulation and control that my parents had always used. When George or Margaret called with requests to see Ethan, I set a clear, non-negotiable boundary. If you want to see Ethan, it is only if you both agree to attend family therapy. I will not put my son back in such a toxic environment. George's reaction, as I expected, was one of explosive rage. He yelled into the phone, his voice filled with anger. "Are you blackmailing your parents? You're so unfilial. I'm not going to that therapy crap. Who do you think you are to dictate terms to me? But this time, I didn't tremble. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't back down. I was used to my parents' manipulation and emotional suppression, and I was tired of taking it all in. I was no longer the confused, emotional daughter. I was a mother, sane and strong, setting boundaries that would not be violated. I had begun the healing process. For Ethan and for myself, the journey ahead will certainly be full of obstacles, but I know I have chosen the right path. And for my son, I am ready to face any challenge without wavering. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and I began to settle into a new routine. Ethan went to his therapy sessions with Dr. Carter regularly, and I was there for him during each visit. In his grandmother's warm, softly lit room, Ethan gradually opened up. But every word he said made my heart clench. He began to remember more clearly what had happened. The constant comparisons he had made with Lily and Sophie, Rachel's perfect granddaughters. He said Lily was smarter than me, and Sophie was better, Ethan said, his voice still reserved. Every time I did something wrong, he would scold me, calling me stupid, and Grandma would criticize me for being slow at housework, saying I wasn't as quick as Lily or Sophie. She said I was her son, but I was lazy and couldn't do anything. I felt like a maid. Every word he said was like a knife stabbing at my heart. Those seemingly small things, biased comments, malicious comparisons, petty accusations, turned out to be deep wounds in my son's young soul. I realized that this was no longer a family conflict issue. It was a systematic form of emotional abuse that was silently destroying Ethan's confidence and self-esteem bit by bit. As I continued to sort through my finances after I stopped paying my parents' rent, I stumbled upon something that shocked me. In an old box in storage, I found a series of receipts and expense reports from my parents over the years. They were large expenditures on unnecessary luxury items, lavish vacations, and countless unplanned impulse purchases. What shocked me most was that there was no evidence that they had ever saved for retirement. I even found petty credit card debt scattered everywhere, from banks to anonymous personal loans. I was stunned. For years, I believed I was helping my parents through a temporary crisis. I thought I was their only support, that my sacrifice was the right thing to do. But now I understand. They never intended to take care of themselves. They lived lavishly, indulged themselves, and relied on me as an endless source of support. I was no longer a child. I was just an ATM that they assumed would always be able to dispense money, no matter the day or month. That truth was like a slap that woke me up. But it was also that shock that helped me firmly affirm that I could not continue to be a victim in this toxic, dependent relationship. I was too naive, too soft-hearted. Just as I was lost in a whirlwind of thoughts, my phone suddenly rang. The name that surprised me appeared on the screen. Aunt Susan, my father George's younger sister. A gentle, private woman who rarely contacted my family. I had never received a call from her before, so when I saw her number appear, I couldn't help but be confused. Laura, I heard you stopped paying your parents' rent? Aunt Susan's voice rang out, soft but with obvious concern. I took a deep breath, gathered my emotions, and told the whole story. From beginning to end, holding nothing back. I had no reason to hide the truth anymore. Aunt Susan sighed, a heavy sigh filled with years of pent-up frustration. Laura, I know George and Margaret have caused you a lot of trouble, but you know your parents have always been spendthrifts since they were young. They borrowed money from many people, from friends to relatives, and were always dependent on others. Your father had a small gambling habit, and your mother spoiled Rachel, never teaching her to be independent. Neither of them ever learned what it meant to take responsibility for their own lives. Aunt Susan's words were like the final piece of a puzzle that had been in my head for a while. It all made sense now. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't selfish. I was protecting myself and my son, from a toxic cycle that had been going on for generations. I realized that my parents had manipulated me not only financially, they had manipulated Ethan and me emotionally. They had exploited my filial piety, exploited my son's innocence to maintain a loose, irresponsible lifestyle. But now, the curtains were lifted. I was no longer blind. The truth, bitter as it was what I needed most to let go of my guilt and strengthen my resolve. I would reclaim my freedom, and I would do anything to protect Ethan, even if it meant going against the very bonds of family. A few weeks after my conversation with Aunt Susan, a surprising development occurred. George and Margaret, realizing that I had absolutely no intention of giving in and that they were in a real financial crisis, reluctantly agreed to come to Dr. Carter's office to see Ethan. I knew full well that this decision was not made out of remorse or enlightenment. They were simply cornered by financial pressures and a sense of isolation. Even as they agreed to see a therapist, they were still trying to control the situation in their own way. That morning, George called me. "Laura, Mom and Dad are coming to pick Ethan up. Before we go to that psychiatrist, we need to talk to him privately." His voice was still the same unyielding, commanding tone. I gripped the phone tightly, taking a deep breath to calm myself. "No, Dad. If you want to see Ethan, meet me in Dr. Carter's office, where there's clinical supervision. I'll take Ethan there. Just come straight to the office." In the end, they had to agree. When I brought Ethan in, George and Margaret were already sitting in the waiting room. The atmosphere was thick with tension, almost palpable in every glance, every gesture. George sat with his arms crossed, his eyes coldly staring straight ahead, while Margaret silently bowed her head, avoiding eye contact with me. Dr. Carter, a quiet woman with elegant silver hair and gentle eyes, had prepared a cozy but formal room. She invited Ethan to a separate playroom, supervised by an assistant, so he could express himself freely without the pressure of his grandparents' presence. As we sat down, Dr. Carter began our conversation in a soft, clear voice. She explained that the purpose of today was to begin to address the trauma in our family relationships, especially the severe impact Ethan had suffered. I sat up straight, no longer the reserved woman I had been. Now I was a mother who knew the value of protection, not just for my son, but for myself. I looked straight at George and Margaret. My voice was calm but sharp, each word spoken with unwavering determination. "First," I said, "you need to acknowledge the emotional abuse you have done to me and Ethan. Your son has suffered so much from your comparisons, your indifference, your coldness." George immediately interrupted, his voice harsh. "What the hell are you talking about? Abuse? Do you think just because you give a little money gives you the right to insult your parents? All you care about is money, Laura. I didn't expect you to." I didn't flinch. I looked straight at him, my eyes unwavering. "Dad, this isn't about money. This is about respect, about my son's emotional security. I've worked so hard over the years, giving you everything, and in return, you've only been treated with contempt and manipulation. You've not only hurt me, you've hurt Ethan." Dr. Carter interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "George, Margaret, setting boundaries in your family is essential to building healthy relationships. Emotional abuse, whether intentional or unintentional, has serious consequences, especially for children." I continued, not giving George a chance to protest further. "Second, you must commit to attending all family therapy sessions to learn how to communicate and behave fairly with everyone, especially Ethan." I paused, took a breath, and continued. "Third, absolutely no negative words, no comparing Ethan to anyone. If you want to see my son, all future meetings must be supervised by me or someone I trust. I will never let Ethan face his pain alone again. And finally," I finished, my voice firm, "I will no longer support you financially. You must take care of yourselves. It is time to learn to be responsible for yourself." George gripped the armrests of his chair tightly, his face flushed with anger, and he was still mumbling something incoherent. But what surprised me was Margaret's reaction. She stopped avoiding him and quietly raised her head, her eyes red. In a soft voice, she said breathlessly, "Laura is right. We were really wrong." Though Margaret's words were barely a whisper, to me they rang out like the first bell of change. George stopped speaking loudly. Maybe it was because he was surprised by the admission, or maybe it was because he was beginning to realize that he was increasingly alone in his fight against the truth. The meeting ended. I left the office exhausted, but with something warm and fuzzy inside me. A glimmer of hope. While the road ahead was long and difficult, I knew I had laid a solid foundation. I had established necessary boundaries, forced my parents to confront the truth, and created a safe space for my son. This was more than a confrontation. This was a turning point. For me and for Ethan. After the tense confrontation at Dr. Carter's office, I focused all my attention and love on Ethan, on the healing journey that my son needed to be on. Regular therapy sessions with Dr. Carter gradually became an essential part of our lives. I was always there for Ethan during each session, holding his little hands, giving him courage, encouraging him with my eyes, with a trusting squeeze of his hand. At first, Ethan was still closed off, only answering the doctor with short, curt sentences. But over time, I saw each brick in the cold wall he had built gradually cracking. Ethan's change didn't come like a whirlwind. It came slowly, patiently, like a tiny sprout quietly reaching for the light after a storm. Something was reborn in him, step by step, breath by breath. I began to notice subtle but profound changes in Ethan's behavior. He was no longer so nervous when I asked him to help with housework. If before he was timid, afraid of making mistakes and shrinking back as if he was about to be scolded, Ethan now became more proactive, willing to try simple tasks. I remember one time I asked him to wash the dishes. Ethan accidentally dropped a spoon. Before, he must have panicked, looking at me with fear. But that time, Ethan just calmly picked up the spoon, put it in the sink, and continued working. There was no trace of panic. There was only calmness and determination in his eyes. He even raised his head to look at me, smiled slightly, and said, "Mom, I'm done. Can I wipe the table for you too?" Those simple words made my heart tremble, both touched and choked with happiness. At school, Ethan's changes also began to blossom, like the first buds of spring. Teachers regularly called me to inform me of his remarkable progress. Ethan was no longer quietly hiding in the crowd. He was more integrated, confidently participating in group activities. He began to proactively raise his hand to speak and laugh and joke with his friends during recess. Parent-teacher conferences, which used to make me tense because of complaints, were now moments filled with joy. I heard compliments and positive comments about him, that Ethan was becoming sociable, caring, and expressing his emotions naturally. But perhaps what made me happiest was seeing the smile on my son's lips again. A bright, innocent smile, true to the childhood Ethan deserved. His eyes no longer had the sadness and wariness they once had. The nightmares that haunted him after returning to his grandparents' house gradually disappeared. Ethan slept more deeply, waking up every morning with a relaxed, energetic face. He began to tell me about his new friends, his classes, his favorite games, seemingly small things, but the most vivid evidence of a miraculous recovery journey. Dr. Carter also clearly noted the change. During one session, she looked at me with warm eyes and said, "Ethan is doing very well, Laura. Your son still shows signs of anxiety, but with your patience and love, I believe Ethan is fully capable of recovery. Removing Ethan from his negative environment was the best decision you could make. You have created a safe place for him to heal." Dr. Carter's words were more than just encouragement. They were powerful confirmation that I had chosen the right path. In that moment, I felt as if a great weight had been lifted. I felt stronger, more grounded as I watched my son come back to life. And I understood that setting clear boundaries with my parents was not selfish, not ungrateful, as they had accused me of being, but a necessary action to protect Ethan and myself. Ethan's recovery completely dispelled any lingering guilt I had. It rekindled the belief that I had done the right thing, that cutting off my dependence and confronting my parents' toxicity was the necessary release for both of us. I had not only saved my son from the hurt I had silently endured, but I had also opened a new path for him, one filled with light, love, and a better future. Ethan deserved to have a real childhood, complete, safe, and untainted by the past of irresponsible adults. A few months after the confrontation at Dr. Carter's office, changes in my family began to emerge. Slowly, tentatively, but clearly. George and Margaret were forced to face the harsh reality. Without my support, they could no longer afford to maintain the old house they had clung to for so long. Eventually, they had to sell it and move to a smaller, more modest apartment on the outskirts of town. I know this was a hard blow for them, but I also understood that it was the inevitable consequence of the dependent and irresponsible lifestyle they had maintained for so long. To my surprise, after weeks of cold calls and angry messages, George and Margaret reluctantly agreed to family therapy with Dr. Carter. Maybe it was the financial pressure, maybe it was the feeling of isolation, or maybe it was Dr. Carter's sharp analysis that forced them to look at themselves. They had nowhere else to turn, and I was determined not to back down this time. In therapy, George still got frustrated and defensive at times, but they did at least begin to acknowledge some of their responsibility. The acknowledgments were tentative and awkward, sometimes just a quiet nod when Dr. Carter made a point, or a quiet remark like, "We were a little too hot with Ethan." For me, that was a significant shift, a subtle but enough signal that I realized change was possible. They began to relearn how to communicate, no longer just to argue or to impose, but to listen, to understand, even though it was all still very rudimentary and lacking in fluency. Then one day, I got a call from Margaret. Her voice was trembling and somewhat reserved, which was rare. "Laura, I want to ask, can you let us meet Ethan? Just at the park with you to be safe." I nodded in agreement. It was the first time they had asked for something while respecting my boundaries. Our first meeting took place in a small park near my house. George and Margaret arrived early, and to my surprise, they brought a brand new box of Legos, Ethan's favorite. George, looking a little embarrassed, handed the gift to Ethan. "I heard he likes Legos. I bought it for him." His voice was still dry, but I saw a questioning look in his eyes, and perhaps a little awkward regret. Ethan was hesitant at first, but when he saw the familiar gift, his eyes lit up. He happily accepted it, and for the first time, I saw my parents show genuine interest in what they liked, instead of scolding, comparing, or demanding. It wasn't a complete change, but it was certainly a hopeful start. It wasn't just George and Margaret that my sister Rachel began to show positive changes. I learned from Dr. Carter that Rachel had agreed to attend therapy with her two daughters, Lily and Sophie. Maybe it was the doctor's advice, or maybe it was pressure from her mother. But whatever the reason, Rachel began to look at her parenting style. Over the next few sessions, under my supervision or Dr. Carter's, Rachel became more friendly with Ethan. She even took the initiative to guide Lily and Sophie to play with Ethan, instead of leaving the three children to fend for themselves coldly as before. The relationship between the children began to improve, slowly, sometimes awkwardly, but it was clearly on the right track. George and Margaret had not changed completely, though. They still had their old selves, hot-tempered, accusatory, evasive, but I saw signs of growing up. The loss of financial support, the struggle between old age and a new life, all of it forced them to face themselves. They began to understand that their dependence was no longer acceptable, and if they truly wanted to continue to have a relationship with Ethan and me, they had to change. My setting of clear boundaries, along with the persistence of therapy, though slow and challenging, is slowly changing our family dynamics. It's not magic, but it's a real journey, step by step, little by little. And I know it's a long journey with many things to face, but at least for the first time in years, I feel like we're on the right track. It's been a year since I firmly established hard boundaries with my family. A year of tears, struggles, and small, courageous steps forward. And today, surrounded by the laughter of children at the playground, Ethan's 8th birthday party was a shining milestone in our journey to recovery. I spent days preparing for the party, trying to create a colorful world with bright balloons, a birthday cake shaped like Ethan's favorite superhero, and gifts wrapped with love and care. Ethan, my little boy, was shining brightly today. He ran around with his friends, his eyes shining with innocence, his laughter echoing throughout the space, erasing all traces of the past. There was no trace of insecurity, no more of the worried eyes that had haunted him. Seeing Ethan so happy, I felt relieved and at peace, as if the sun had finally come out after so many storms. What touched me most about the day was the presence of George and Margaret. They arrived early, dressed neatly, and without the harsh looks or judgmental words they had before. George, though a little awkward, took the initiative to talk to a few of the other parents, even showing interest in hearing about their children. Margaret smiled gently, her eyes on Ethan filled with an emotion I had never seen before, genuine concern, not constant scrutiny. They brought a small gift, a colorful illustrated science book about the universe. Exactly the subject Ethan had been passionate about recently. It was a simple gift, but to me it represented a big change. They were starting to listen and understand their grandson's interests. Ethan, unable to hide his surprise, hugged the gift to his chest and ran to hug his grandparents in a natural and warm way, an image that almost brought me to tears. Rachel was there too, with Lily and Sophie. For the first time in a long time, I saw the two children behaving nicely, happily playing with Ethan and his friends without the arrogant, contemptuous attitude. Rachel, who used to be distant and cold, took the initiative today to help Ethan blow out the candles and sing happy birthday together. She even asked about school and friends, things she had never cared about before. I didn't expect a miracle, but small changes like this carried more weight than any apology. Throughout the party, there was no criticism, no toxic comparisons, no constant suffocation. People treated each other with respect, with gentleness. George and Margaret occasionally shared memories of Rachel and me as children. Not all of them pleasant, but I could tell they were trying to reconnect. They asked Ethan questions, no longer commands, no longer scolding, but genuine questions, with the intention of understanding rather than controlling. I stood in a corner, silently observing my son and my family. My heart was trembling with emotion. A year ago, this scene would have been unimaginable. I had gone through long sleepless nights, days of struggle, loneliness, and doubt. I used to wonder if I was being too cruel, if I was destroying something sacred. But now, looking at Ethan laughing and joking carefree, looking at my parents taking the first steps on their journey of change, looking at Rachel starting to open up, I knew I was right. I didn't give up. I broke the cycle of hurt, rebuilding a safe, kind, loving foundation for Ethan. My family, while not perfect, still scarred, is at least learning to heal. And most of all, they are learning to respect the boundaries I set. This is not the end, but it is certainly a beginning. A new chapter of hope that I fought for with all my might. The evening after Ethan's birthday party, when the lights were off and the playground was quiet, my son and I returned to our familiar apartment, where the smell of balloons and cake still lingered. Ethan, after a day full of laughter, was now curled up in a warm blanket, his eyes still shining with joy. I sat next to him, reading him his favorite fairy tale, my voice as gentle as a gentle breeze lulling him to sleep. As soon as he finished the last chapter, Ethan turned to look at me. His round eyes held a strange, questioning look, an expression I had rarely seen on him. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice as soft as a breath. Should I forgive my grandparents? I was momentarily stunned. An innocent question, but filled with thoughts beyond his childhood. I gently placed my hand on his head, stroking his soft, cloud-like hair. Why are you asking me that, Ethan? The child was timid, her tiny fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket, hesitant. I remember Grandpa scolding me, Grandma not saying anything. I was scared, but today they gave me a present and sang me happy birthday. They don't scare me like before. I think, can I forgive them, Mom? I took a deep breath. Forgiveness is a complicated concept, especially when the wounds are still fresh. I don't want to force it on my child, and I don't want to make him think that love means tolerance. Forgiveness must come from understanding and willingness, not from obligation. Forgiveness isn't always easy, Ethan. I began softly, choosing my words carefully. You don't have to forgive if you're not ready. Your feelings are real, and you have every right to feel sad and hurt. But I think your grandparents are trying to change. They're learning to love you better, to be kinder. I placed my hand on her cheek, feeling the familiar warmth. The most important thing is to always remember, you deserve to be loved without fear. You deserve to be happy, to be yourself. And I will always be here, protecting you, not letting anyone, not even your loved ones, hurt you again. Ethan was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if searching for the answer to a complicated question. Then suddenly he turned and smiled, a smile as clear and sweet as the morning sun. I think you and I are like doing a difficult math problem at school, Mom. It's hard, but if you try, you can do it. I paused. That simple yet profound statement moved me to tears. In my arms was a small child, but one with a big heart and a strangely empathetic soul. I squeezed him gently, tears welling up silently, warm at the corners of my eyes. My son is so smart and kind, I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. In that moment, a profound truth seemed to burst forth in my heart. The revenge I had thought of was never to hurt my parents. Not to make them pay, to make them suffer, but to break the silent but persistent cycle of toxicity, the one that had held me for years and threatened my son. It was my journey to regain peace for us, to end the distorted way of loving that had been passed down from generation to generation. Ethan, even at a young age, was beginning to learn the lesson that took me a lifetime and many tears to understand, that forgiveness can be a way out when we are no longer bound by the past. That change is real when we dare to set boundaries and stand firm in their defense. I learned that true love is not blind sacrifice. It requires fairness, listening, and healthy boundaries. Boundaries are not meant to divide, but to preserve. To protect what is most precious, the hearts of those we love. I did the right thing, not just for Ethan, but for myself. And because of that, I was, finally, free. It's been a year since I stood up, had the courage to face my family, and ended the toxic cycle that had surrounded me for so many years. Looking back on that journey, I am still amazed at the profound changes that have occurred. Ethan and I's lives are now as if cleansed of darkness, filled with light, as peaceful as the sky after a storm, leaving a clear, cloudless space. Ethan, my little boy, has grown up wonderfully. He is no longer the shy, reserved boy he once was. At school, he has become a confident, active boy who actively connects and participates in all group activities. Ethan has achieved proud academic achievements, passionately exploring the world with eyes wide open with curiosity, no longer afraid of making mistakes or being judged. He has made many friends, is loved by his teachers, and every day when he comes home, he is chattering away with jokes or excitedly sharing new things he has learned. The anxiety that used to creep into his eyes has now completely disappeared, giving way to a radiance and optimism that warms my heart to the point of choking. George and Margaret have also made significant progress. though their journey has been anything but smooth. They have continued to attend therapy sessions with Dr. Carter, and it has brought real positive change. While they still fall back into their old reflexes, the unconscious complaints and mild annoyance when I reassert boundaries, they have learned to be more independent. They have learned to manage their own finances, and they no longer call Ethan for help as often. Meeting Ethan at the park or in therapy together has become a healthy habit, and in each of those meetings, I have seen them work to build a kinder relationship with their nephew. They no longer compare or criticize, but instead listen, learn about Ethan's interests, and express their feelings more gently and sincerely. I know they will never change completely, but the fact that they stop, look back, and proactively change their behavior is a miracle beyond expectation. My sister Rachel has also begun to overcome her own darkness. After a long period of denial, blaming, and criticizing me, she finally acknowledged the bias in the way her parents raised us, as well as her own silence about the trauma Ethan had suffered. She continued therapy with Lily and Sophie, her two children, and thanks to that, the way she raised her children gradually changed. She learned to listen to them more, put less emphasis on achievements, and instead encourage them to express their feelings and thoughts. Although my relationship with Rachel cannot return to what it was before, it has gradually transformed into a relationship based on respect and understanding. We can sit down, talk calmly, and sometimes she even asks me for my parenting experiences, something I would never have dared to dream of before. As for me, I felt as if I had just stepped out of an invisible cage that had held me captive for so long. No more burdens of expectations, sweet manipulations, or lingering wounds from the past. I had learned something valuable. Setting boundaries is not selfish, but an act of love. For myself and for my loved ones. By protecting Ethan from the hurt I had suffered, I was also healing myself. I had learned to face my fears, to accept necessary losses in exchange for freedom and peace. My life is mine now, my choice and my shape. And the path I choose is a path of love, respect, and freedom. For me, for my son, and perhaps for those close to me who have hurt me. My story is not a fairy tale where all the hurt disappears overnight, or where the sweet ending comes from a miracle. It is a real journey, sometimes slow, sometimes painful, but real and hopeful. It is proof that healing and change do not come easily. They take time, patience, and most of all, a heart brave enough to face it, dare to stand up, and dare to choose a different path. Boundaries are not walls that separate relationships, but rather a solid foundation for building healthy relationships of respect, listening, and love. Sometimes, in order to protect the people we love most, we are forced to make decisions that hurt others and confuse ourselves. But sometimes, the initial confusion is a stepping stone to later healing. Always remember, your worth is not in losing yourself to please others. True love does not require you to lose yourself. Listen to your inner voice. Trust your intuition, especially your mother's intuition. And if necessary, have the courage to stand up and break the toxic chains that have held you for so long. For the safety of your children and your own is always worth fighting for. And sometimes the journey itself, however imperfect, is the most beautiful gift you can give to the next generation. Thank you for listening to my journey.